I was standing in the middle of my living room, surrounded by gold-embossed wrapping paper and silk ribbons that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. I was holding a set of hand-carved Swedish building blocks for my grandson Leo and a professional-grade calligraphy set for my granddaughter Piper. My heart, usually a cold engine fueled by blueprints and bottom lines, felt uncharacteristically warm. It was Thanksgiving in Chicago, the kind of afternoon where the wind howls off Lake Michigan like a banshee, but inside my penthouse, the air smelled of expensive bourbon and the faint, lingering scent of pine. I was finally going to see my family. More importantly, I was finally going to forgive my son. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the granite countertop. It was a text from Miller Vance, my business partner of 35 years, and the only man alive who knew where my skeletons were buried. The message was short, but it struck me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Sterling, do not go to that dinner tonight. Turn the car around. You need to know the truth about Silas before you step into that house. Meet me at the club in 20 minutes. It's a matter of life and death, and I'm not talking about your health. I stared at the screen, the bright festive lights of my Christmas tree suddenly looking like a blurred mess of warning signals. My thumb hovered over the call button, but my hand was shaking. I didn't know it yet, but the man I called my son had spent the last 6 months sharpening a knife specifically designed to fit between my shoulder blades. The illusion of my perfect legacy was about to shatter, and the man who broke it was the one I had built it for. To understand how I got to that moment, you have to understand the glass tower I've spent my life inhabiting. My name is Sterling Harrison. In the world of high-stakes architecture, my name is synonymous with steel, glass, and an uncompromising eye for detail. I built Harrison, Vance from a two-man operation, in a basement, into the premier firm in the Midwest. I've survived 3 recessions, 2 hostile takeovers, and a dozen lawsuits. But I wasn't prepared for the war that was brewing in my own bloodline. The trouble had truly started 2 months earlier. I remember the exact smell of the air that day, ozone and wet asphalt, as Silas stormed into my office without so much as a nod to my assistant. He didn't sit. He planted his hands on my mahogany desk, leaning over me like a predator. Silas had always been sharp jawline, sharp suits, and a sharp tongue that he'd inherited from his mother. But that day, the sharpness felt jagged. "You're killing the Kensington project, Dad," he'd hissed, his face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "The investors want the modern glass aesthetic. They want the sleek, minimalist edge. Your neoclassical insistence is making us look like a relic. You're holding the firm back, and frankly, you're costing us millions in potential growth." I had remained seated, my fingers interlaced, watching him with a calm I didn't truly feel. I had raised him on the best schools, the best vacations, and eventually, a corner office at 32. I'd given him the world on a silver platter, but apparently, he was annoyed that the platter wasn't platinum. "This firm was built on timelessness, Silas," I'd replied, my voice a low rumble. "We don't build for the next 5 years. We build for the next century. You've been a junior partner for 5 minutes. Do not mistake your ambition for expertise." He'd slammed his fist down, rattling the crystal decanter on my sideboard. "Ambition is all this firm has left. You're stuck in the motngin chin trum chin muis, Sterling. Either you hand over the reins and let me move us into the future, or I'll find a way to take them. This isn't a suggestion. It's a courtesy warning." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. I had stood up then, slowly, using every inch of my height to remind him whose name was on the building. "This company isn't furniture, Silas. You don't just inherit it because you've reached a certain age. You earn it. And right now, you haven't earned a damn thing." He'd spun on his heel and walked out, the heavy oak door slamming with a force that made the framed awards on my wall shudder. I hadn't spoken to him since that day. Not a word, not a text. Until yesterday. The phone call had come in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the Chicago skyline. "Dad, it's me," Silas had said. His voice lacked the fire of our last encounter. It sounded weary, almost contrite. "Look, I know things got heated. I was out of line. But Thanksgiving is tomorrow. Sloan and the kids really want you there. Piper made a centerpiece specifically for Grandpa's spot. Can we just put the business stuff aside for one night? For the sake of the family?" I wanted to believe him. Every father has a blind spot the size of a tectonic plate when it comes to his children. I told myself he'd realized that family was the only thing that lasted when the steel and glass eventually crumbled. I told him I'd be there. I even felt a surge of pride, thinking he was finally showing the emotional maturity required to lead a firm like ours. The morning of Thanksgiving was gray and biting. I spent it in my home office, finishing up some revisions for the Sterling Heights project, but my mind was already at Silas's house in the suburbs. I pictured the kids running to the door, the smell of Sloane's rosemary stuffing, and the quiet nod of reconciliation I expected from my son. Around noon, Miller Vance stopped by. We'd been partners since we were 23, and he was the only person who could read the micro-expressions on my face. He'd brought a bottle of scotch, a tradition of ours, but he didn't open it. He just sat in the leather chair across from me, his gray eyes tracking my every move. "You're actually going, aren't you?" Miller asked, his voice gravelly. He apologized, Miller. He sounded like himself again. Not the executive, but my son. Miller sighed, a sound that seemed to come from his shoes. "Just be careful, Sterling. I've been looking at some of the internal server logs. Silas has been active. Very active. Especially in the legal archives and the partnership agreement folders." I'd waved him off. "He's probably just trying to understand the structure for when he eventually takes over. He's ambitious. We were the same way at his age. We were hungry, Sterling." "We weren't predatory," Miller said, standing up to leave. "There's a difference between wanting to build something and wanting to take what's already built. Just keep your eyes open. If something feels off, it probably is." I dismissed his concerns as the typical paranoia of a man nearing retirement. I went out and bought the gifts, spending a small fortune at a boutique toy store where the clerks wore white gloves. I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted to show Silas that I wasn't just his boss. I was his provider, his foundation. Now, standing in my living room with Miller's ominous text glowing on my phone, the warmth in my chest vanished, replaced by a cold, oily dread. I grabbed my coat and left the gifts on the floor. I didn't even turn off the Christmas tree. The drive to the Oak Club was a blur of taillights and swirling snow. My mind was racing, trying to reconcile the son who had called me yesterday with the truth Miller claimed to have found. I pulled into the valet stand, my tires screeching on the salt-crusted pavement, and practically ran inside. The club was nearly empty, the elite of Chicago tucked away in their mansions for the holiday. Miller was sitting in a high-backed booth in the far corner of the lounge, a thick manila folder resting on the table like a tombstone. He didn't say hello. He didn't offer me a drink. He just pushed the folder toward me. "I had a private investigator look into Silas's private meetings over the last 6 weeks," Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. "He hasn't been meeting with clients, Sterling. He's been meeting with Marcus Blackwood." The name made my blood run cold. Blackwood was a corporate undertaker. He specialized in hostile takeovers, liquidations, and most notoriously competency challenges. He was the man you called when you wanted to forcibly remove a founder who refused to quit. "I don't understand," I stammered, opening the folder. The first thing I saw was a photograph. It was Silas, looking sleek and predatory, shaking hands with Blackwood outside a high-end steakhouse. The date stamp was from 3 days ago, the same day Silas had called me to reconcile. "Keep looking," Miller urged. I flipped the page. My breath hitched. It was a draft of a legal petition. The header read, "Harrison, Vance Architecture, Emergency Governance Motion." It was an application to have me declared mentally unfit to manage the firm's affairs. It cited erratic behavior, declining cognitive function, and gross professional negligence. But the worst part wasn't the legal jargon. It was the evidence attached. There were internal memos. I'd supposedly written memos filled with gibberish, nonsensical instructions, and aggressive outbursts directed at staff. "I never wrote these, Miller," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I've never seen these in my life." "I know you didn't," Miller said, his face etched with a profound sadness. "He forged them, Sterling. He's been using his administrative access to plant these in the system for months. He's building a paper trail of your insanity. And that dinner tonight? The one he invited you to?" I looked up, the world tilting on its axis. "What about it?" "It's not a Thanksgiving dinner, Sterling. It's an ambush. He's invited 3 members of the board and a court-appointed psychologist. They aren't there for turkey. They're there to witness your breakdown firsthand. He's going to provoke you, get you to lose your temper in front of witnesses, and then he's going to serve you with those papers before the pumpkin pie is even on the table." I looked down at the folder, at my son's smiling face in the photograph, and I felt something inside me die. The father who wanted to forgive was gone. In his place was the man who had built an empire out of nothing. I checked my watch. It was Born muy lum p.m. Dinner was at num, ba muy. "What are you going to do?" Miller asked. I closed the folder with a sharp, decisive snap. The dread was gone, replaced by a cold, vibrating rage that felt more like electricity than emotion. "I'm going to go to dinner, Miller," I said, my voice as hard as a granite slab. "But I'm not going as a guest. And Silas? He's about to find out exactly how incompetent I really am." I walked out of the club, the Chicago wind hitting me like a slap to the face. I didn't feel the cold. I only felt the weight of the folder in my hand, and the sudden, terrifying clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose but his pride. What happened next changed everything, because my son had forgotten one very important rule. I didn't just build the firm. I built him. And I knew exactly how to tear him down. As I drove toward the sprawling suburbs of Lake Forest, the windshield wipers on my Jaguar hummed a rhythmic, mocking tune. The snow was coming down harder now, white sheets blanketing the manicured lawns of Chicago's elite. Every house I passed was a monument to old money and carefully curated legacies, the very things I had spent 40 years helping these people build. I looked at the manila folder sitting on the passenger seat, a heavy weight that seemed to radiate a cold, dark energy. I shouldn't have been going to that house. I should have been calling the police, or at least a team of high-priced litigators. But there was a stubborn, dying part of me that needed to see the betrayal for myself. I needed to see the look in Silas's eyes when he realized I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a witness. I started thinking back to the beginning, searching for the moment the rot had first set in. I'd always blamed myself for being an absent father during the early years of Harrison Vance, but I thought I'd made up for it with a level of silver-spooned opportunity most men can only dream of. When Silas got into Cornell, I didn't just pay the tuition. I ensured he had a lifestyle that matched the Sterling Harrison name. Between the private tutors, the summer internships in Dubai and London, the luxury housing, and the 4-year degree, I'd poured nearly $4 million into his education. I'd looked at it as an investment in the future of our firm. I thought I was building a successor. I didn't realize I was funding my own executioner. The memory of his graduation day was particularly bitter now. We had stood on the campus, the Ithaca sun bright and promising, and I'd handed him the keys to a brand new Porsche. He'd looked me in the eye and promised to make me proud. He told me he'd take the Harrison name to heights even I couldn't imagine. At the time, I thought he meant through innovation and hard work. Now, I realized he simply meant he'd take everything I'd built and paint his own name over it. I should have known then that Silas didn't want to build skyscrapers. He just wanted to stand on top of them. When I turned into the gated driveway of his estate, a 12,000-square-foot colonial I had bought for him and Sloan as a wedding gift, I noticed something that made my stomach do a slow, nauseating flip. There were 4 cars already parked in the circular drive. 2 I recognized immediately. The black Mercedes belonging to Harrison Sterling. No relation, just a coincidence of name and a longtime board member, and the silver Lexus of Arthur Kensington, the firm's most senior outside director. But it was the 3rd car that stopped my breath. A nondescript dark blue sedan with a local university faculty sticker in the corner. I didn't know the owner of that car yet, but I knew what they represented. Miller's warning echoed in my mind, a court-appointed psychologist. Silas hadn't just invited me to dinner. He had staged a performance, and he'd made sure the critics were already in their seats. I sat in the car for a long moment, the engine idling, watching the warm light spill out of the massive front windows. It looked so inviting, so quintessential. Inside that house were my grandchildren, Leo and Piper, probably playing near the fireplace. But standing in the shadows of the foyer was a man I had raised, waiting to tell the world I was no longer fit to hold my own pen. I grabbed the manila folder and shoved it under the driver's seat. I wouldn't reveal my hand yet. If Silas wanted a performance, I would give him the role of a lifetime. I stepped out into the biting wind, adjusted my coat, and walked toward the door. I didn't know it then, but the next 2 hours would be the most difficult architectural challenge of my life. I had to keep my temper from collapsing while my own son tried to pull the foundation out from under me. The door was opened not by a maid, but by Sloan. She was dressed in a sleek, charcoal-colored sweater dress, her pearls glowing in the hallway light. Sloan was the daughter of a federal judge, a woman who understood the optics of power better than anyone I'd ever met. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that felt like a surgical strike, cold and precise. "Sterling, you're here," she said, her voice a practiced melody of false warmth. We were starting to get worried. "Silas said you've been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately, a bit forgetful." I felt the first spark of rage hit my gut, but I smothered it. "The Chicago traffic is the only thing I'm forgetful of, Sloan. It gets worse every year, doesn't it?" I walked into the foyer, and the scene was exactly as Miller had described. In the sunken living room, sipping 20-year-old scotch, were Harrison and Kensington. They both stood up when I entered, their expressions a confusing mix of pity and professional distance. But it was the man standing by the fireplace who drew my focus. He was in his late 50s, wearing a tweed jacket that screamed academic and holding a notebook as if it were a shield. "Dad," Silas called out, stepping through the archway from the dining room. Could looked every bit the successful hair tall, confident, with a smile that reached his eyes but didn't quite warm them. He walked over and clapped me on the shoulder, his grip just a little too tight, a little too much like a restraint. "I'm so glad you made it. You remember Harrison and Arthur, of course. And this is a new friend of ours, Dr. Elias Vane. He's a consultant we're working with on the new Wellness Center project." Dr. Vane stepped forward and shook my hand. His eyes didn't leave mine. He was scanning me, looking for the tremors, the hesitation, the declining cognitive function Silas had promised him. "A pleasure to finally meet the legend, Mr. Harrison," Vane said. "The legend is just a man who worked harder than everyone else, Doctor," I replied, my voice steady. "I wasn't aware we were discussing the Wellness Center on Thanksgiving. I thought tonight was about the kids." "Oh, it is," Silas said, guiding me toward the bar. "But you know us, Dad. The work never really stops, does it? Especially lately. You've been so focused on the legacy projects. We just want to make sure the transition to the new phase is smooth." He poured me a drink, the same bourbon I'd kept in my office for years. As he handed it to me, I noticed his hand was steady, while mine was vibrating with the effort of not throwing the glass at his head. I looked over at my board members. These were men I had made millionaires. Men I had vacationed with in the Hamptons. And here they were, sitting in my son's house, participating in a quiet coup over appetizers. "I heard about the Kensington proposal, Sterling," Arthur Kensington said, leaning back in his chair. "Silas mentioned there were some discrepancies in the final blueprints you submitted. Some issues with the structural load calculations. That doesn't sound like you." The discrepancies were the forgeries Miller had found. Silas had swapped my actual blueprints for ones riddled with amateur mistakes, then presented them to the board as proof of my failing mind. He was gaslighting me in my own industry. "Blueprints are a living document, Arthur," I said, taking a slow sip of the bourbon. "Sometimes the mistakes are just tests to see who's actually paying attention to the details. Wouldn't you agree, Silas?" Silas laughed. A sharp, barking sound. "Always the philosopher, Dad. But in the real world, tests can be expensive. We just want to make sure the firm stays on solid ground. That's why we invited Dr. Vane. He specializes in organizational health and executive longevity." Executive longevity. It was a beautiful euphemism for how to put the old man out to pasture. The dinner bell rang, a silver chime that sounded like a funeral bell to my ears. We moved into the dining room, a space dominated by a table that could seat 20. The children were already there, Piper and Leo, looking like miniature versions of the elite world they were being raised in. They ran to me, and for a moment, the ice around my heart thawed. I hugged them tight, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and innocence. "Grandpa." "Did you bring the blocks?" Leo asked, his eyes wide. "They're in the car, Leo," I whispered. "We'll play with them later. I promise." I sat at the head of the table, the seat Silas had pointedly left for me. It felt like a throne on a sinking ship. As the first course, a delicate butternut squash soup, was served, the conversation stayed light, but the air was thick with subtext. "Doctor." Vane kept asking me casual questions about my history, my memories of the firm's founding, and my thoughts on current market trends. Every time I answered, I could see his pen moving under the table, recording my lucidity. I watched Silas. He was orchestrating the evening with the precision of a master conductor. He would prompt a board member to mention a problem at the office, then look at me with a pained expression of concern when I tried to explain the reality. He was making me look defensive, rattled, and worst of all, confused. "Dad," Silas said, leaning forward as the turkey was carved. "I was looking at the Henderson files this morning. You remember the meeting we had on Tuesday? The one where we decided to pass on the venture?" I stared at him. "We didn't have a meeting on Tuesday, Silas. I was in Springfield at the site visit." Silas sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound. He looked at Dr. Vane, then at the board members. Sloan reached out and touched his hand, as if offering support for the burden of a failing father. "Dad, we were in your office for 2 hours on Tuesday," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper of feigned heartbreak. "We signed the rejection letter together. Don't you remember?" I felt the blood drain from my face. I hadn't been in my office on Tuesday. I had the toll receipts and the GPS logs from my trip to Springfield to prove it. But in this room, in front of these witnesses, my word was being weighed against a son who looked like he was mourning my mind. I looked at the table, at the silver and the crystal, and realized that if I didn't play this perfectly, I would walk out of this house with nothing but a court order for a psychiatric evaluation. Maybe the Springfield air got to me, I said, forcing a smile that felt like it was cracking my skin. You're right, Silas. It must have slipped my mind. I saw Dr. Vane's pen fly across his notebook. Silas's eyes flashed with a momentary spark of triumph. He thought he had me. He thought the forgetfulness was the final nail in my coffin. But as I took another bite of the turkey that tasted like ash, I made a silent vow. He wanted to play with memories? Fine. I would give him a memory he would never be able to erase. What happened next changed everything. Because just as Silas was about to deliver his prepared speech about transitioning leadership for the good of the family, his own phone buzzed on the table. It was a notification from the office's internal security system. I leaned back, the cold rage in my chest finally turning into a sharp, predatory focus. I didn't know it yet, but the trap I had set before leaving the club was about to spring. Silas looked at his phone, his brow furrowing in confusion, his face slowly losing that smug, golden sun glow. Is something wrong, Silas? I asked, my voice as smooth as silk. You look like you've seen a ghost, or maybe just a reflection of someone you don't recognize. The vibration of the phone against the mahogany table sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence of the dining room. Silas stared at the screen, his thumb hovering, his face undergoing a fascinating transformation from smug victory to a pale, tight-lipped mask of anxiety. For a man who prided himself on being the ultimate modern executive, always connected, always in control, he looked remarkably like a boy who had just realized the floor was falling out from under his treehouse. Is everything all right, Silas? I asked, my voice holding the gentle, slightly confused cadence of the failing patriarch I was portraying. You look a bit peaked. Perhaps it's the stress of the Kensington project. I know how much you've been invested in it. He didn't look up. He was too busy reading whatever Miller Vance had just sent through the company's emergency alert system. I had instructed Miller to trigger a system-wide integrity protocol at exactly so, Kong PM. It was a failsafe I'd built into our servers years ago, one that locked down all administrative access and sent an automated report of the last 48 hours of file modifications to every board member's private email. Silas didn't know it yet, but the forged memos and doctored blueprints he'd worked so hard to plant were currently being flagged as unauthorized external modifications on the tablets of the men sitting right next to him. It's nothing, Dad, Silas managed, his voice an octave higher than usual. He shoved the phone into his pocket, but his fingers were twitching. Just a server glitch at the office. You know how the legacy systems can be. A bit temperamental. Like I said, we really need to move everything to the cloud-based Montgomery suite. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. The cloud, I mused. It sounds so ephemeral, doesn't it? As if you can just make things disappear by wishing them into the sky. But in my experience, the more you try to hide a foundation's flaws, the more likely the whole structure is to come down on your head. Dr. Vane's pen scribbled furiously. I could practically see the diagnosis forming in his head. Patient is prone to cryptic metaphors and fixated on structural integrity. Classic sign of cognitive rigidity. I let him write. Every stroke of that pen was a credit I was building for the moment I cashed in his professional reputation. You've always been obsessed with foundations, Sterling, Arthur Kensington said, his tone still patronizing, but tinged with a flicker of unease. He had just felt his own phone vibrate in his jacket pocket. But times change. Sometimes you have to build on shifting sand and just use better pilings. I suppose so, I replied. But tell me, Arthur, do you remember the Grandmont project? 15 years ago? Arthur's face stiffened. The Grandmont project had been Silas's first real test after he'd joined the firm. He had been 24, fueled by Cornell's prestige, and a desperate need to outshine my shadow. He'd tried to cut a deal with a local inspector to overlook a seismic bracing issue that would have cost us 6 weeks and $500,000 to fix. I'd found out, fired the inspector myself, and made Silas spend the next 2 months on the job site in the Chicago winter, personally overseeing the manual installation of every single steel bracket. It was the first time I saw the true Silas, not the son, but the man. He hadn't been sorry for the mistake. He'd been humiliated by the correction. He hadn't learned about integrity. He'd learned how to be more careful with his deceptions. I looked at him now, across the expensive turkey and the fine china, and realized that I had been gardening a snake for 3 decades, wondering why the flowers kept dying. "Grandmont was a long time ago, Dad," Silas said, his voice cold. He was looking at his wife, Sloane, seeking some kind of signal. Sloane, ever the daughter of Judge Montgomery, stepped in with the grace of a practiced litigator. "I think what Silas means is that we should focus on the future. We're all family here, and we're all worried. Silas, why don't you show your father that document we discussed, the one about the restructuring of personal assets?" This was it, the move. Silas reached into his blazer and pulled out a sleek, leather-bound folio. He slid it across the table toward me. It was a voluntary power of attorney and a transfer of majority voting rights. If I signed it, I remained the chairman emeritus with a nice title and a pension, while Silas gained absolute control over Harrison Vance. "We just want to protect you, Dad," Silas said, his voice dropping into that rehearsed, empathetic tone that made my skin crawl. "With the way things have been, the forgetfulness, the confusion about the Springfield trip, it's only a matter of time before a client notices. If you sign this now, we can handle everything internally. No scandals. No public competency hearings. Just a quiet, dignified transition." I looked at the document. Then I looked at Dr. Vane, and I imagine the doctor here is prepared to testify that this is in my best interest, to ensure I'm not being coerced. Dr. Vane cleared his throat. "Based on our conversation tonight, Mr. Harrison, and the documented instances of memory lapse provided by your son, I believe a transition of authority is the most medically sound path to reducing your stress levels." I picked up the fountain pen Silas had conveniently placed on top of the folio. It was a Mont Blanc I'd given him for his 30th birthday. The irony was almost poetic. "You know, Silas," I said, twirling the pen between my fingers, "I didn't know it yet, but when I bought you this pen, I was buying the instrument of my own signature's demise. You've become quite the artist with it. I've seen the memos. The way you mimic the H in Harrison, the slight tremor you added to make it look like an old man's hand, it's truly impressive." The table went dead silent. Silas's eyes went wide, his pupils shrinking to pinpricks. I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," I said, my voice losing its feeble edge and returning to the baritone command that had terrified contractors for 40 years. I turned to Arthur and Harrison. "Check your phones, gentlemen. You should have just received a notification from the firm's security server. It seems there was a breach. Someone using Silas's administrative credentials was caught planting forged documents in the archive at Ba Mulam AM last Tuesday. The same Tuesday Silas claims I was in the office having a meeting I forgot." Arthur scrambled for his phone. Harrison was already reading, his brow furrowing as he scrolled. Silas made a grab for the folio, but I pinned it to the table with one hand. "Wait," Silas stammered, his face turning a chaotic shade of violet. That's a misunderstanding. I was just cleaning up the files. Dad, you're confused again. You're having an episode. Doctor, tell him." Dr. Vane looked like he wanted to vanish into the wallpaper. He looked at Silas, then at the board members, realizing that he might have just hitched his professional wagon to a sinking ship of corporate fraud. "I'm not having an episode, Silas," I said, standing up. I was no longer the tired old man in the chair. I was the architect who had built the very walls he was trying to trap me in. But what I am having is a realization. I spent $4 million on your education at Cornell. I spent $400,000 on the down payment for this house. I gave you a title, a salary, and a legacy. And all you could think to do with those gifts was forge my name and try to gaslight me into a sanitarium. I looked at my grandchildren, who were staring at us with wide, frightened eyes. My heart broke for them, but the rage for their father was stronger. "Leo, Piper, go upstairs to your rooms for a moment. Grandpa needs to talk to your daddy about business." Sloane stood up, her face a mask of frozen aristocratic fury. "Sterling, you can't do this. You're making a scene. Think about the children. Think about the Montgomery name." "I am thinking about the children, Sloane," I said, turning my gaze to her. "I'm thinking about the fact that they're being raised by two people who think loyalty is something you trade for a corner office. As for the Montgomery name, I'm sure your father, the judge, will find the upcoming fraud investigation very illuminating." Silas stood up, knocking his chair back. "You have no proof. A glitch in the server isn't proof of anything." "Oh, I have more than a glitch, Silas," I said, leaning in. "I have Miller Vance, and I have the forensic audit that started the moment I walked into this house." But most importantly, I have the one thing you never bothered to build for yourself. I paused, let the silence hang heavy in the air, the tension vibrating like a bridge in a gale force wind. I have the truth, I whispered. And the truth is, you didn't just fail to take my company. You just lost your family. All of it. I turned to the board members. Arthur, Harrison. I'll see you in the boardroom tomorrow morning at Tarm, Hong AM. We'll be discussing Silas's immediate termination and a referral to the state's attorney for corporate forgery. Dr. Vane, I suggest you leave before my lawyers decide to include you in the conspiracy suit. Vane didn't wait. He grabbed his briefcase and bolted for the door. The board members followed, their faces grim, avoiding Silas's eyes as if he were already a ghost. As the front door clicked shut, the silence in the dining room was deafening. Silas was shaking, his hands gripped so tight on the edge of the table that his knuckles were white. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, there was no smugness. There was only the raw, naked terror of a man who had gambled everything on a lie and watched the house win. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, I can explain." I picked up the Mont Blanc pen, the one I'd given him, and tucked it into my own pocket. "Don't call me Dad, Silas," I said, walking toward the foyer. "The man who was your father died the moment you walked into Marcus Blackwood's office. What's left is just the man who owns this house, and I want you out by the end of the weekend." I walked out into the snow, my heart heavy, but my head clearer than it had been in years. I didn't know it yet, but the battle wasn't over. Silas wasn't the type to go quietly into the night. He still had one card left to play, a secret that involved my late wife, and a choice I'd made 30 years ago, a secret he thought would destroy me. What happened next changed everything, because I was about to find out that the betrayal went much deeper than a company. It went all the way to the grave. The drive back to my penthouse was a blur of neon lights reflected on wet asphalt. I should have felt like a victor. I had walked into a lion's den and come out with the lion's teeth in my pocket. I had exposed the forgeries, humiliated the corporate undertaker, and sent the board members scurrying back to my side of the aisle. But as I watched the dark waters of Lake Michigan churn under the Chicago sky, I felt a hollow ache in my chest that no amount of professional triumph could fill. I had won the company, but I had finally, irrevocably, lost the boy I used to carry on my shoulders through the Lincoln Park Zoo. I walked into my apartment, the silence greeting me like a cold shroud. The Christmas tree was still twinkling in the corner, a festive reminder of the man I had been only 6 hours ago, a man who still believed in the sanctity of a father-son bond. I poured myself a double bourbon, not even bothering with ice, and sat by the window. I thought it was over. I thought the next steps were merely administrative legal filings, a formal board vote, and the long, slow process of scrubbing Silas's influence from the firm. What I didn't know yet was that Silas hadn't been playing a game of checkers, he was playing a game of arson, and he was perfectly willing to burn down the entire forest just to make sure I didn't have a tree to sit under. At Ba. Hong AM, my personal laptop chimed. It was an email from an encrypted address. No subject line, just a single attachment, a PDF titled, The Mot Ngin Chin Trum, Chin Mui Sao, Sterling Montgomery Accord. My hand froze over the mouse. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out through the vents. Diana, my late wife, the woman whose memory was the only thing I held more sacred than my company. She had been a Montgomery old money, older secrets. When she died of a sudden pulmonary embolism 10 years ago, I had retreated into my work, using the steel and glass of my buildings to shield myself from the grief. But before she was my wife, she had been my partner's sister, and before that, she had been a woman with a secret that could have ended Harrison, Vance, before it ever broke ground. I opened the file. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a series of scanned bank transfers, handwritten notes, and a non-disclosure agreement signed by a local building inspector who had long since passed away. It was evidence of the Kensington breach. 30 years ago, during the construction of the Sterling Kensington Towers, a massive structural flaw had been discovered in the foundation. Fixing it would have bankrupted the firm and sent me to prison for negligence. Diana, using her family's connections and a significant portion of her inheritance, had paid to bury the report and bribe the inspectors while we quietly reinforced the steel under the cover of night. It was the one black mark on my soul, the one time I had prioritized my legacy over the truth. I had done it for her. I had done it to protect the life we were building. And now, my own son was holding it over my head like a guillotine. The phone on the side table buzzed. It was a text from the same unknown number. I told you I'd find a way to take the reins, Sterling. Either you rescind the termination and sign the power of attorney by noon tomorrow, or this file goes to the Chicago Tribune and the Department of Buildings. I'm sure the residents of the Kensington Towers would love to know they're living on a foundation of bribes and lies. Mom would be so proud of how well we keep secrets, wouldn't she? I felt a surge of nausea so violent I had to grip the edge of the desk. Silas wasn't just coming for my money now, he was coming for my soul. He was willing to drag his mother's name through the mud, to destroy the very woman who had saved us, just to spite me. I didn't sleep. I spent the rest of the night pacing the length of my living room, watching the sun rise over the city. Every building I looked at felt like a lie. I realized then that Silas's manipulation went far deeper than a few forged memos. He had been digging through Diana's old private journals, her safe deposit boxes, and her family archives for years. He hadn't just been waiting for me to get old. He had been waiting for the right moment to use his own mother's ghost as a weapon. At Tom, Hong AM, I called Miller Vance. He has the Kensington file, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Miller knew. He had been the one who helped Diana move the money 30 years ago. How? He's been a gravedigger, Miller. He found the paper trail Diana forgot to burn. What are you going to do, Sterling? If this gets out, it's not just the firm. It's criminal charges. Even after 30 years, the statute of limitations on corporate fraud and endangerment in this state is a nightmare when there's a paper trail. I know, I said. He wants me to sign over the firm by noon. He wants to be the one to save the legacy by burying the secret again. You can't give in, Miller said, his voice rising in panic. If you give him the firm under blackmail, he'll never stop. He'll bleed you dry until there's nothing left but a shell. I'm not giving him the firm, I said, looking at a photo of Diana on my desk. She was smiling, her eyes bright with the same intelligence I now saw reflected in Silas's cruelty. But I'm not letting him destroy her memory either. I told Miller to meet me at the office in an hour. I had a plan, but it required a level of risk that made the Kensington bribe look like child's play. I had to outmaneuver a man who had no moral compass, using only the fragments of a past I had tried to forget. I arrived at the Harrison, Vance building at Cheen, Bamui AM. The atmosphere was electric. Word had leaked about the incident at dinner, and the staff was moving in hushed, nervous clusters. I walked straight to Silas's office. I didn't knock. He was sitting at his desk, looking refreshed, a smirk playing on his lips as he sipped an espresso. He looked like a man who had already won. You're early, Sterling. Did the morning news make you anxious? You're a disgusting human being, Silas, I said, standing in front of his desk. To use your mother's memory this way, even for you, this is a new low. Silas set the espresso down carefully. Don't get self-righteous with me. You're the one who took the money. You're the one who built a career on a lie. I'm just the one who's willing to live with the truth. Or, more accurately, I'm the one who knows how to manage it. You think you can manage a structural scandal? I asked. The moment that file hits the Tribune, every building we've touched in 3 decades will be under a microscope. You won't be taking over a firm. You'll be presiding over a funeral. I've already talked to Blackwood, Silas said, leaning back. We have a strategy. We'll frame it as a voluntary audit. We'll find a scapegoat from the old days, someone like Miller, and claim you were misled. I'll come in as the new, ethical leadership, clean house, and the firm survives. You, however, will be retiring to a very quiet life of disgrace. Unless, of course, you sign the papers. He slid the same leather-bound folio from last night across the desk. Beside it was a gold pen. I looked at the document. It was a total surrender. Silas would own the majority of the shares. He would have the power to fire Miller, to liquidate assets, and to rewrite the history of the firm. You have 2 hours, Sterling, Silas said, checking his watch. The reporter at the Tribune is waiting for my call at noon. He thinks I'm giving him a tip on a new development project. I'd hate to disappoint him with the story of the century instead. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I looked Silas in the eye, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of doubt in his gaze. He expected me to fight, to scream, to plead for Diana's sake. He didn't expect me to smile. You know, Silas, I said, I always told you that a good architect never looks at just the blueprint. He looks at the site. He looks at what's under the ground. I didn't sign the paper. Instead, I took the pen and wrote a single word across the top of the first page. Denied. Silas's face contorted. You're bluffing. You'd rather go to prison? You'd rather have the world know what Mom did? No, I said. leaning over the desk until we were inches apart. I'd rather the world know what you did. You think you're the only one who's been digging? I've spent the last 3 hours on the phone with the executor of your mother's estate, your Uncle Silas Montgomery, the man you were named after. The smirk finally vanished from Silas's face. The Montgomery family was notoriously private and incredibly powerful. Silas had always been their favorite, the golden grandson who would carry their prestige into the next generation. Uncle Silas doesn't care about the firm, Silas stammered. He doesn't care about the firm, I agreed. But he cares very much about the Montgomery Trust. And he cares about the fact that you've been funneling money from your mother's private foundation into Marcus Blackwood's offshore accounts to pay for this little coup. I didn't know it yet, but while you were looking for my secrets, you were leaving a trail of your own. You didn't just steal from me, Silas. You stole from the Montgomerys. The color drained from Silas's face so fast it was like a curtain falling. I've already sent him the forensic audit Miller and I compiled this morning. I continued, my voice a low, lethal whisper. The Montgomerys don't go to the Tribune, Silas. They don't go to the police. They handle things internally. And right now, you're no longer a Montgomery to them. You're just a liability. Suddenly, the door to the office opened. It was my assistant, looking pale. Mr. Harrison, there are 2 men here from Montgomery Holdings. They say they're here to escort Silas to a meeting with the family council. Silas looked at the door, then back at me. The predator was gone. The executive of the future was gone. In his place was a terrified man who had just realized that the ghost he tried to weaponize had a family that was still very much alive. Wait, Dad, Silas whispered, his voice trembling. We can talk about this. I'll delete the file. I'll leave the firm. Just don't let them take me. I stood up and straightened my jacket. I felt no pity. I felt no love. I only felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a man who had finally finished a project. What happened next changed everything, Silas, I said, walking toward the door. Because for the first time in 30 years, I'm not protecting you, and neither is your mother. I walked out as the 2 men in dark suits entered his office. The escalation was complete, and the humiliation was just beginning. But as I walked toward the elevator, I knew that the biggest twist was still waiting for me in the basement of my own firm, a secret Silas hadn't found, and one that would either save us both or bury us forever. The silence that descended upon the executive floor of Harrison Vance after the heavy mahogany doors closed behind Silas was more deafening than any shouting match. I stood in the center of the lobby, the morning sun casting long, skeletal shadows of the steel skyscrapers across the polished marble floor. My staff men and women I had handpicked, mentored, and in some cases, known since they were interns, stood frozen like statues in an architectural garden. They had just watched the Crown Prince, the man they thought was the future of this firm, being escorted out by 2 men who looked like they belonged in a federal courthouse, not a design studio. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply walked back to my office, my footsteps echoing with a finality that signaled the end of an era. But as the door clicked shut, the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright began to drain away, leaving behind a cold, viscous exhaustion. I sat at my desk and looked at the empty space where Silas had sat just minutes ago. I had won this round, but the victory tasted like copper and old dust. Miller Vance walked in 5 minutes later. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knew I wasn't. He went to the sideboard, poured 2 fingers of the expensive bourbon I usually reserved for closing 8-figure deals, and set it in front of me. The Montgomerys don't play, Sterling, Miller said, taking the chair opposite me. Their family office is already freezing his personal accounts. They've pulled his name from the foundation's board. By tomorrow, Silas won't be able to buy a cup of coffee without asking for a loan. He'll fight, Miller, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. A man like Silas doesn't go quietly. He's like a structural crack. You think you've patched it, but the pressure just moves to another floor. What about the Kensington file? Miller asked, leaning forward. If he's desperate, he'll leak it anyway. He's already burnt his bridge with the family. He might decide to take the whole city down with him. I looked at the small, antique brass key sitting on my blotter. I'd taken it from my private safe that morning. It was a key to a world Silas didn't even know existed. He won't leak it, because he doesn't have the whole story. He only has the version he found in Diana's journals. He doesn't know about the basement. Sterling, you've been talking about the basement for 24 hours, Miller said, his brow furrowing. What is down there? That building is 80 years old. The sub-basement is just storage for old blueprints and rusted pipes. Not the storage room, Miller. The vault behind the seismic reinforcement wall. the one we built in Chinwe. I stood up, signaling for Miller to follow. We took the service elevator down, bypassing the sleek, glass-fronted floors where the firm's future was being designed, and descended into the bowels of the building. The air grew colder, smelling of damp concrete and the metallic tang of old machinery. This was the foundation of my empire, the literal dirt and steel, upon which every one of my dreams had been constructed. We reached the sub-basement. I walked past the rows of filing cabinets and the stacks of topographical maps to a heavy, reinforced concrete wall in the far corner. I pressed a hidden release in the masonry, and a small panel slid back, revealing a high-security keypad and a keyhole. I didn't know it yet. I whispered as I entered the code. But when Diana helped me hide the Kensington breach, she wasn't just protecting me, she was protecting herself. She knew that one day, Silas would become exactly what he is now. She saw the greed in him when he was still in grade school. The heavy steel door ground open. Inside was a small, climate-controlled room. It wasn't filled with gold or cash. It was filled with boxes of documents original, unredacted records of every project Harrison Vance had ever touched. In the center of the room sat a single, leather-bound ledger with Diana's initials embossed in gold. I opened it to the section marked Kensington. I pointed to a series of documents Silas had never seen. He thinks the bribe was the secret. He thinks the structural flaw is the leverage. But look at this, Miller. Miller adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the technical reports. His breath hitched. Sterling, this isn't a report of a failure. This is a report of a fix. Precisely, I said. We didn't just bribe the inspectors to look away. Diana used her inheritance to hire an independent engineering firm from Germany to fly in under the radar. They reinforced the entire subterranean grid using a revolutionary carbon fiber wrap that wasn't even legal in the US yet. The building is actually 4 times stronger than the city code required. The bribe wasn't to hide a flaw. It was to hide the fact that we used unapproved, experimental technology to fix it because the city's bureaucracy would have tied us up in court for a decade while the foundation crumbled. So Silas's proof of a dangerous building is actually proof of an over-engineered one? Miller asked, a slow smile spreading across his face. Exactly. If he leaks that file to the Tribune, he'll be exposing a technical violation of building codes from 30 years ago, yes. But I'll counter with the actual engineering specs. The building is a fortress. And the bribe money? It didn't go to the inspectors. It went to a private escrow account Diana set up to pay for the German engineers. The inspectors were just told to lose the paperwork so we could work without interference. Why did she keep the journal sounding so guilty then? Miller asked. Because she knew Silas was a snoop. I replied, my heart aching. She wrote those journals as a trap. She knew if he ever tried to betray me, he'd go for the Kensington project first. She gave him enough truth to make him feel powerful, but not enough to actually destroy us. She gave him a gun with no firing pin. I felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that even from the grave, Diana was still the smartest person in the room. But the peace was short-lived. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a call from the firm's security desk. Mr. Harrison? We have a situation in the lobby. It's Mrs. Harrison. Sloan. She's making a scene, sir. She's brought a news crew. The escalation had reached its boiling point. Silas might have been neutralized by the Montgomerys, but Sloan was a Montgomery by marriage and a shark by nature. She wasn't about to let her life of luxury evaporate without a fight. She was leaning into the only weapon she had left, public sympathy. I raced back upstairs. When the elevator doors opened to the lobby, it was chaos. Sloan was standing in front of 2 cameras, her eyes red-rimmed but her posture perfect. She was holding a folder, not the one from Silas, but a different one. My father-in-law is a man of secrets, she was shouting into a microphone. He's been systematically pushing my husband out of the firm because Silas discovered the truth about the Sterling Heights development. He's covering up safety violations that put thousands of lives at risk, and now he's using his old money connections to kidnap my husband. I walked into the frame, my face a mask of calm. Sloan, that's enough. The reporters swarmed me, microphones thrust into my face. Mr. Harrison, is it true your son has been taken against his will? Is there a safety risk at Sterling Heights? My son is currently meeting with his family counsel regarding some personal financial irregularities, I said, my voice steady and professional. As for the safety of our buildings, we have a perfect record. Sloan is understandably upset, but she's being misled. Misled? Sloan screamed, stepping toward me. She looked like a woman possessed. I saw the documents, Sterling. I saw the photos of the cracks in the foundation. You're a murderer in a tailored suit. She lunged at me, trying to claw at my face. Security stepped in, but the damage was done. The cameras had caught everything: the unhinged daughter-in-law, the cold patriarch, and the accusation of a mass casualty disaster. Within minutes, the video was trending. The firm's stock, which had been stable for years, began to tick downward. I looked at Sloane as she was being led away, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of the rot. Silas hadn't just manipulated me. He had poisoned his own wife with lies to ensure he had a backup plan. He had turned his family into a suicide squad. I retreated to my office, but the phone didn't stop ringing. Clients were canceling meetings. The city's Department of Buildings was calling for an emergency hearing. My victory in the basement was already being overshadowed by the fire Sloane had started in the lobby. I sat down and looked at my computer screen. A new email popped up. It was from Silas. He must have found a way to access a device. "You think the Montgomerys can keep me in a room forever, Sterling? I'm already out, and Sloane is just the beginning. You might have the real blueprints, but the public doesn't care about the truth. They care about the scandal. I've already sent the bribe documents to the state's attorney. I'm turning myself in as a witness, Dad. I'm going to tell them you forced me to help you cover it up. I'll take a plea deal. But you? You're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell. See you at the hearing." My hand trembled as I gripped the mouse. He was going to commit professional suicide just to ensure I died with him. He was claiming he was a distressed whistleblower, coerced by an abusive father. It was a masterclass in manipulation. But Silas had made one fatal mistake. He had forgotten that I wasn't just an architect. I was the man who had designed the very prison he was trying to put me in. I looked at Miller, who was watching me with an expression of pure dread. "Call the investigator," I said. "Tell him I want the footage from the nursery." "The nursery?" Miller asked. "What are you talking about?" "Silas's house. I had the security system upgraded as a housewarming gift 3 years ago. I told him it was the best money could buy. I didn't tell him it had a secondary, encrypted server that records audio in the common areas, one that only I can access." I began typing, my fingers flying across the keys. I bypassed the main hub and dived into the hidden partition I'd installed for maintenance. I found the date from 3 weeks ago, the night Silas and Sloane had sat in their kitchen planning the competency strike. What happened next changed everything, Miller. I whispered, the audio beginning to play through my speakers. Through the grainy, low-light footage, I saw Silas and Sloane sitting at their table. But they weren't talking about architecture. They were talking about me. And then Silas said something that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Once the old man is in the institution, we don't just take the firm, Sloane. We liquidate the Kensington Towers. I've already talked to the demolition crew. We're going to stage a controlled failure during the renovation. The insurance payout alone will be $300 million. We'll be out of the country before the first body is pulled from the rubble." I looked at Miller. His face was white. We weren't just looking at corporate fraud anymore. We were looking at a conspiracy to commit mass murder for insurance money. "He didn't just want the company, Miller," I said, my voice cold with a new, terrifying clarity. "He wanted to destroy the building I built for his mother. He wanted to kill the very legacy he was pretending to protect." The cliffhanger wasn't just about my survival anymore. It was about the lives of the 2,000 people living in the Kensington Towers. I had the evidence, but Silas was already at the state's attorney's office. If I didn't move in the next hour, he would be granted immunity as a whistleblower, and my evidence would look like a desperate, fabricated retaliation. I grabbed my coat and the laptop. "Get the car, Miller. We're not going to the board meeting. We're going to the governor." But as we reached the elevator, the lights in the building flickered and died. The emergency sirens began to wail, not just in our building, but across the city block. I looked out the window and saw a plume of smoke rising from the north. The Kensington Towers. The controlled failure wasn't a plan for the future. Silas had already pulled the trigger. The sound of the sirens wasn't just a noise. It was a physical vibration that rattled my teeth and shook the very foundation of the Harrison Vance building. I stood at the window, my breath fogging the glass, as a second plume of gray smoke blossomed from the north side of the city, the Kensington Towers. My masterpiece. The building that held my wife's secrets, my career's risks, and the lives of 2,000 people. "Sterling, the elevator is dead. We have to take the stairs," Miller shouted over the roar of the emergency system. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was staring at the skyline, watching as the lights of the city flickered like a dying heart. I didn't know it yet, But the explosion I was witnessing wasn't the end of my legacy. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would strip away everything I thought I knew about my own blood. Silas hadn't just tried to take the company. He had decided that if he couldn't own the crown, he would melt it down and pour the liquid fire over everyone I loved. The demolition, I whispered, my voice sounding like dry leaves. He didn't wait for the hearing, Miller. He knew I had the Montgomerys on him. He's clearing the evidence. We have to go. Now. Miller grabbed my arm, his grip painful. We descended 40 flights of stairs in a haze of red emergency lights and the frantic shouting of employees. My knees screamed with every step, a reminder of the 63 years I'd spent building a world that was currently turning to ash. By the time we hit the street, the air was thick with the scent of burning rubber and pulverized concrete. The Chicago wind, usually a biting companion, was now a bellows, fanning the flames that were visible even from 5 miles away. We didn't wait for my driver. I hijacked a company courier's motorcycle, Miller clinging to my back as I wove through the gridlocked traffic of downtown Chicago. People were abandoned their cars, staring north with looks of sheer, unadulterated terror. As we got closer to the Kensington Towers, the scale of the disaster became clear. The North Podium, the section that housed the luxury retail outlets, and the primary structural transfer beams, was a jagged maw of twisted steel and fire. The building hadn't collapsed. Not yet, but it was groaning, a deep, metallic shriek that sounded like a wounded whale. Look! Miller pointed toward the perimeter of the police cordon. There, standing in the middle of a swarm of reporters and first responders, was Silas. He was wearing a high-visibility vest over his designer suit, a smudge of soot artfully smeared across his forehead. He was holding a megaphone, directing people with the practiced authority of a savior. Sloane was beside him, draped in a thermal blanket, her face a mask of tragic heroism. I warned them. Silas was shouting into a news camera. I told the Department of Buildings. My father, Sterling Harrison, ignored the structural warnings for 30 years. I was trying to organize an evacuation when the foundation gave way. This is his doing. This is the Harrison, Vance legacy. I felt a surge of nausea so violent I almost dropped the bike. He was doing it. He was committing mass murder in broad daylight and framing me for the fallout. He was using the very bribe file he'd stolen to provide the motive for my negligence. I pushed through the crowd, my heart hammering against my ribs. Silas. He turned, and for a split second, I saw it. The flicker of pure, crystalline panic. He didn't think I'd make it here so fast. He thought I'd be trapped in the blackout at the office, but the panic was quickly replaced by a sickening, triumphant grin. There he is, Silas shouted, pointing at me as the cameras pivoted. The man who built this tomb. Get him away from the site. He's dangerous. Police officers moved toward me, but I didn't back down. I pulled the laptop from my bag, the one containing the audio of Silas and Sloane planning this very accident. Officer, wait, I screamed over the roar of the fire. I have the blueprints. I know how to stop the collapse. That stopped them. The lead fire marshal, a man named Jax Blackwood, the estranged, honest brother of the corporate undertaker Silas had hired, stepped forward. He looked from me to the burning tower. You're the architect, Jax said, his eyes hard. Tell me why that north corner hasn't fallen yet. By all laws of physics, that beam should have snapped 10 minutes ago. I looked up at the tower. I saw the fire licking at the transfer beams, and then I realized why the building was still standing. The carbon fiber, I whispered. The German reinforcement. Silas didn't know about it. He placed the charges where the original blueprints said the weak points were. But the reinforcements are holding. He's trying to blow up a tank with a firecracker. What are you talking about? Jax demanded. The building is over-engineered, I shouted. The fire is only on the surface. If you can get to the secondary cooling vents and activate the manual suppression, the structure will reset. But you have to do it from the sub-basement. My son, he's telling you the foundation is gone, but it's not. He's trying to keep you out so the fire can eventually melt the steel. Silas pushed forward, his face contorted with rage. He's lying! He's trying to cover his tracks! The basement is a death trap. Don't listen to him. Silas, shut up, Jack snapped. He looked at me, then at the building. If you're wrong, we lose 40 men in that basement. If you're right, we save 2,000. Give me the key. I handed him the brass key from the vault. I'm going with you. The hell you are, Jack said. I designed it. I'm the only one who knows the layout of the unmapped reinforcement tunnels. If you hit a gas line, we all die. You need me. We moved. While the world watched the spectacle of the fire, A small team of us slipped into the service entrance. Silas tried to block the path, screaming about liability and safety. But the Montgomery men who had been trailing him finally stepped out of the shadows. They didn't say a word. They just gripped Silas by the arms and dragged him toward a black SUV. The family council had seen enough. The descent into the Kensington basement was like entering the circles of hell. The heat was oppressive, and the air was thick with the taste of sulfur. My lungs burned, and every step felt like a victory over gravity. We reached the seismic wall, the one I'd built with Diana's secret money. "There," I said, pointing to a valve assembly hidden behind a false masonry panel. "That's the coolant bypass. It's filled with flame-retardant gel. If we open it, it floods the structural cavities of the north corner. It'll freeze the fire from the inside out." We worked in frantic silence. Jax and his men turned the massive iron wheels while I monitored the pressure gauges. For a moment, nothing happened. The building ground again, a sound like 1,000 car crashes. Dust rained down from the ceiling. "It's not working," one of the firefighters yelled. "Wait," I said, my eyes fixed on the needle. "Come on, Diana. Help us." Suddenly there was a deep, thundering clunk in the pipes, a hiss of escaping gas, and then the sound of liquid rushing through the walls. On the monitors, the temperature in the north corner began to plummet. The controlled failure had been thwarted by the very secret Silas had tried to use to destroy me. We emerged from the basement an hour later, soot-stained and gasping for air. The fire was out. The smoke had turned from black to a harmless white steam. The Kensington Towers stood tall, a scarred but unbroken sentinel over the city. The cameras were still there, but the narrative had shifted. Miller Vance had spent the last hour playing the audio recording of Silas and Sloan for the lead investigator of the state's attorney's office. I saw Silas sitting in the back of a police cruiser, his hands cuffed, his hero vest torn. Sloan was in another car, her face buried in her hands. The Montgomery family lawyers already standing 20 feet away, refusing to acknowledge her existence. I walked up to the car where Silas sat. He looked at me through the glass, his eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You should have let it fall, Sterling," he hissed. "You would have been a legend, a tragic figure. Now you're just an old man with a broken building and a son who hates you." "No, Silas," I said, my voice quiet. "I'm the man who saved 2,000 people from his own son. And as for being a legend, I don't care about that anymore. I just care about the truth." I turned away from him, but as I did, the lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Miller, stepped into my path. She was holding a tablet, and her expression wasn't one of gratitude. "Mr. Harrison, we've recovered the audio. It's damning for your son, but we also recovered something else from the sub-basement ruins." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" "The original Mutngin Chin Tram Chinwi Sour ledger. The one you said was a technical fix." She looked at me, and for the first time, I felt the ground truly fall away. "The German engineers you hired?" We checked the records. "They didn't just wrap the beams in carbon fiber, Sterling. They found something else in the ground. Something you and your wife buried along with the structural reports." "I don't understand," I stammered. "They found human remains, Mr. Harrison. Specifically, the remains of the 2 union leaders who went missing during the Motngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Lum labor strike. The ones who were threatening to shut down the Kensington project. And according to the ledger, the bribe money didn't go to engineers. It went to the disposal of a problem." The world went silent. I looked at Miller, but he had turned his back to me. I looked at the tower, and suddenly, the carbon fiber didn't feel like a reinforcement. It felt like a cage. I didn't know it yet, but Silas's betrayal was only the second act. The real horror was that my wife hadn't been protecting my legacy. She had been protecting a murder. And now, the building wasn't just standing, it was a tomb that was about to be reopened. What happened next changed everything, because I realized that to save my son from himself, I had accidentally unmasked myself as the greatest villain of all. I sat in a sterile, windowless room in the basement of the Cook County Courthouse. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and the metallic tang of old radiator steam. For 40 years, I had been the man who designed the rooms people wanted to be in. Now, I was in the one room I couldn't design my way out of. Sarah Miller, the state's attorney investigator, sat across from me. She wasn't wearing a thermal blanket or a hero vest. She was wearing a look of professional curiosity that felt like a scalpel. On the table between us was the leather-bound ledger, the one I thought was my salvation. "The Motngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Sao Sterling Montgomery Accord," she said, tapping the cover. "It's a beautiful piece of record-keeping, Mr. Harrison. Your wife had a very meticulous hand. Too bad she used it to document a double homicide. I didn't know, I whispered. The words felt like ash in my mouth. I thought the money was for the German engineers. I thought we were fixing the foundation. Oh, you fixed the foundation all right, Sarah replied, sliding a forensic photo across the table. It was a close-up of a rusted watch, fused into the concrete of the north podium. This belonged to Garrett Miller. No relation to me, but he was a legend in the labor unions back in the 90s. He and his partner, Jackson Sterling again, the name irony is thick today, disappeared 3 days before you poured the main slab. The ledger shows a payout of $200,000 to site clearance. Not engineers, Sterling. Clearance. I looked at the photo, and my mind fractured. I remembered that week in Mutngin Chincham Chinmuilum. I had been in a fever dream of stress, the firm on the brink of collapse, the union leaders threatening to picket the site into oblivion. Diana had told me she would handle the negotiations. She told me her family, the Montgomerys, had a way of making people see reason. I had been so relieved, so desperate to keep building, that I never asked what reason looked like. What happened next changed everything, because the door opened, and Silas was let in. He wasn't in handcuffs anymore. He was wearing a suit provided by a new legal team. He looked at me, and the hatred I'd seen in the police car had been replaced by a chilling, predatory calm. "Hello, Sterling," he said, taking the seat next to the investigator. "I suppose the truth is a bit heavier than you expected." "You knew," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "That's why you wanted to demolish the towers. You weren't just looking for insurance money. You were trying to destroy the evidence before the city's mandatory 30-year structural audit next month." Silas leaned back, a small, hideous smile playing on his lips. "I'm a Harrison, Dad. I'm an architect. I know that sometimes, to build something new, you have to clear the site completely. I found Mom's real journals 3 years ago. Not the ones in the vault, the ones she kept in the beach house. She didn't just negotiate with those union men. She invited them to the site for a midnight meeting and had them buried alive in the wet pour." The room seemed to tilt. "Diana, my elegant, brilliant Diana. A murderer? She did it for you, Sterling," Silas hissed, leaning in. "She did it to save your timeless legacy. And I was going to do the same. I was going to blow the north podium, pulverize the remains into dust, collect the insurance, and rebuild a modern masterpiece in its place. I was trying to be the son you wanted. I was trying to protect the name. By killing 2,000 people?" I roared, lunging across the table. Sarah Miller and a bailiff pulled me back. Silas didn't even flinch. "The insurance money would have compensated the families," Silas said with the clinical detachment of a psychopath. "It was a structural necessity. But then you had to be a hero. You had to save the building. And in doing so, you've unsealed your own tomb." Sarah Miller cleared her throat. "Actually, Silas, there's a complication. The ledger isn't in Sterling's handwriting. And the bank transfers for site clearance came from a Montgomery Trust account that only 2 people had access to in Mutngin Chincham Chinmuilum. Diana Harrison and her brother, your uncle Silas Montgomery." I looked at Silas. His face went from triumphant to confused. "But I have a witness," Sarah continued, looking at the door. Miller Vance walked in. My partner, my friend, the man who had been by my side since we were 23. He looked at me with an expression of such profound grief that I knew, before he even spoke, that the final pillar of my life was about to crumble. "I'm sorry, Sterling," Miller said, his voice cracking. "I couldn't let him go through with it. Silas came to me 6 months ago. He showed me what he'd found. He told me if I didn't help him coordinate the controlled failure, he'd tell the police I was the one who pulled the trigger in Chinmuilum." "Were you?" I asked, my heart stopping. "No," Miller whispered. "But I was the one who drove the truck. I was the one who watched Diana give the order. I've lived with that ghost for 30 years, Sterling. I stayed at the firm to make sure the building never failed, because I knew what was inside the walls. I thought if I kept the tower standing, I could keep the secret buried. But Silas, he's not like Diana. She killed to build, he kills to destroy." The silence in the room was absolute. Silas looked from Miller to the investigator, realizing that his whistleblower play had just been superseded by a full-blown murder confession from a co-conspirator. "I'm turning myself in," Miller said to Sarah. "I have the recordings of Silas threatening me. I have the emails where he ordered the demolition charges. I'll go to prison, but I'm taking him with me." Silas stood up, his face a mask of frantic, cornered rage. "This is a lie. It's an old man's delusion. Sterling, tell them. You built this. You're the one who's responsible." I stood up slowly. I felt older than the city itself. I looked at my son, this creature of greed and shadows I had mistakenly called my legacy, and I felt a cold, final clarity. I didn't know it yet, I said, my voice echoing in the small room. But the moment I prioritized the firm over the truth 30 years ago, I lost everything. I thought I was protecting a legacy, but I was just building a monument to a crime. I turned to Sarah Miller. I'll cooperate fully. I'll resign from the firm. I'll fund the exhumation and the memorial for the victims' families. And I'll testify against my son. Dad, no! Silas screamed as the bailiffs moved in. You can't do this. You'll be ruined. The Harrison name will be dirt. The Harrison name is already dirt, Silas, I said, walking toward the door. I'm just finally letting the rain wash it away. As I walked out of the courthouse, the reporters were still there, but I didn't hide. I walked straight into the light of the cameras. I didn't talk about architecture. I didn't talk about steel or glass. I told them the truth about the foundation, about Diana, and about the son who tried to finish what she started. I hit rock bottom that night, sitting in my empty penthouse, watching the news of my own downfall. But as the police began the long, grisly task of dismantling the north podium of the Kensington Towers, I felt a strange, terrifying lightness. The revenge wasn't against Silas anymore. It was against the lie I had lived. What happened next changed everything. Because as the first stone was removed from the foundation, the workers found something else. Something even Miller Vance didn't know about. A final message from Diana, tucked into a lead pipe near the remains. I held the letter in my trembling hands, the ink faded but the intent clear, and as I read her final words, I realized that the ultimate twist wasn't a murder at all. It was a choice I had made 30 years ago that Silas was about to use to pull the final trigger on my life. The paper was yellowed, brittle at the edges, smelling of damp earth, and 30 years of buried silence. It had been tucked inside a lead pipe near the seismic reinforcement wall, a place Diana knew only I or a demolition crew would ever find. My hands shook so violently as I unfolded it that I had to rest them on the cold granite of my kitchen island. Outside, the Chicago morning was breaking, but the city looked different now. The skyline I had helped shape felt like a collection of gravestones. My dearest Sterling, the letter began, her elegant cursive as sharp as a razor. If you are reading this, the world has finally caught up to the shadows we cast. I know you think the money was for the building. I know you think Miller and I handled the negotiations to save your dream. And we did. But there is a truth even deeper than the concrete, one I couldn't bear to tell you while I lived. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at the next paragraph, and the floor seemed to vanish beneath my feet. Silas is not yours, Sterling. Do you remember the summer of Chinwe-Lum? The month you spent in the hospital after the scaffolding collapse? The doctors told me you were sterile, a complication from the internal injuries you refused to acknowledge. I saw the light go out of your eyes when you thought the Harrison name would end with you. I couldn't let that happen. I went to my brother. I went to the Montgomery bloodline to ensure your legacy had a face. Silas is a Montgomery through and through. He carries their greed, their coldness, and their capacity for ruin. I did it to give you a son, but I realized too late that I had given you a monster. I collapsed into the chair, the letter fluttering to the floor. All those years, all the pride I felt watching him grow, thinking I saw my own determination in his eyes, my own passion for the steel and the glass. It was all a curated lie. He wasn't the Harrison heir. He was the byproduct of a Montgomery conspiracy to keep the firm and the family fortune under their shadow. The Harrison legacy Silas had been so desperate to steal was a ghost he wasn't even related to. What happened next changed everything, because I realized that my final revenge wasn't going to be found in a courtroom or a board meeting. It was going to be found in the truth. 2 days later, I sat behind the glass partition at the Cook County Jail. Silas sat opposite me, still wearing the orange jumpsuit that looked like a vulgar insult to his tailored past. He looked thinner, his skin sallow under the fluorescent lights, but his eyes were still burning with that same arrogant fire. He still thought he had a move. He still thought he was the protagonist of this story. Come to offer a deal, Sterling? Silas sneered, leaning toward the glass. The Montgomery lawyers are already working on my bail. I'll be out in 6 months. I'll take a plea on the demolition charges, blame it on mental distress from your abuse, and I'll still have my shares in the company. You're ruined, but I'm young. I can wait. I looked at him, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't see my son. I saw a stranger. I saw a tragic, broken man who had destroyed 2 lives and nearly 2,000 more for a name he had no right to. There is no deal, Silas, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. And there is no company. I've filed for chapter buyer liquidation. I'm selling every asset, every blueprint, and every square inch of the Harrison name. The proceeds are going into a victims fund for the families of Garrett Miller and Jackson Sterling. The firm is dead. Silas's face contorted, his fists slamming against the table. You can't. That's my inheritance. That's my birthright. That's the thing, Silas, I said, leaning in until my forehead almost touched the glass. It was never your birthright. I found your mother's letter, the one she left in the foundation. I watched the color drain from his face. The arrogance flickered, then died, replaced by a confused, hollow terror. I'm not your father, Silas, I whispered. You aren't a Harrison. You're just another Montgomery project that failed the structural audit. Your mother didn't kill those men for our legacy. She did it to protect her secret, to make sure the men who knew about her arrangement with the family doctor never spoke. She didn't do it for me. She did it for herself. You've spent your whole life trying to steal a name that was never yours to begin with. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Silas stared at me, his mouth open, his breath hitching in his chest. The realization hit him like a skyscraper collapsing the weight of his crimes, his betrayals, and his greed. All for a legacy that was a complete and utter fabrication. He wasn't the king in waiting. He was a fraud in a family of frauds. He began to scream, then a raw, guttural sound of a man who had lost his identity. He clawed at the glass, shouting about the Montgomerys, about the money, about how he was still the elite. But I just stood up and walked away. I didn't look back when the guards tackled him. I didn't look back when his voice echoed down the hall, becoming just another noise in a house of criminals. The resolution didn't come with a parade or a new skyscraper. It came with a hammer. 6 months later, I stood on the sidewalk as the final demolition of the Kensington Towers began. Not a controlled failure for insurance money, but a systematic, respectful dismantling. The city had declared the site a memorial. The north podium was gone, the remains of the missing men finally given a proper burial in the sunlight of a Chicago spring. Miller Vance stood beside me. He had avoided jail time by turning state's evidence, but he was a broken man. He had lost his license, his reputation, and his friend. We didn't talk much. Some things are too heavy for words. What will you do now, Sterling? Miller asked, looking up at the empty space where the tower used to pierce the clouds. I'm going to build something else, Miller, I said. Something small, something honest. I liquidated my penthouse and my collection of vintage cars. I took the remaining money, the money that wasn't tied to the Montgomery Trust or the Kensington blood money, and I bought a small plot of land in a forgotten corner of the South Side. I started a nonprofit architectural school for kids who had grown up in the shadow of buildings they were never invited into. I taught them that a blueprint isn't just about how high you can go, it's about how deep you're willing to dig to find the truth. I live in a modest 2-bedroom bungalow now. The air doesn't smell like expensive bourbon, it smells like sawdust and old books. Every Saturday, I visit the memorial at the old Kensington site. I sit on the bench and look at the names of the men Diana killed to protect a lie. I ask for their forgiveness every single time. I haven't seen Silas. I hear he's in a high-security facility in downstate Illinois. The Montgomerys, true to their nature, have scrubbed his name from their records. He is a ghost in an orange suit, a man with no father and no future. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I should have known. I wonder if the signs were always there in the way he looked at a building not as a piece of art, but as a piece of prey. But then I remember the children in my classroom. I see the way they look at a simple drawing of a house, the hope in their eyes, the genuine desire to create something that lasts. I realize then that architecture isn't about the steel. It isn't about the glass. It's about the people who live inside the lines. My name is Sterling Harrison. I once built an empire on a foundation of secrets and blood. I lost my wife, my son, and my legacy to the gravity of my own pride. But as I walk home through the Chicago drizzle, my boots clicking on the pavement, I don't feel like a ruined man. I feel like an architect who finally found the right site. The moral of my story is a simple one, though it took me 60 years and a dozen betrayals to learn it. You can build the tallest tower in the world. You can wrap it in gold and shield it with the most powerful names. But if the foundation is built on a lie, the wind will eventually find the cracks. And when the collapse comes, and it always comes, the only thing that will save you is the truth you were too afraid to tell. I'm finally living in a house that can stand the wind. And for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what's buried under the floorboards.